In the late 70s and early 80s, Nintendo weren't a gaming manufacturer at that point. They were a toy manufacturer. They'd done things like, there was a game called, I think it was called Duck Hunt, which will sound familiar to all of those of you who played that game on the NES, but it was a mechanical toy. It projected ducks onto your wall, and you would shoot them with a light gun, effectively, which was quite a clever thing. They released the Magnavox Odyssey in Japan, or rather they distributed it in Japan, and then went into Pong-type games of their own, with the Color TV Game 6 and Color TV Game 15. Gamester 81 has got a video of one of those. I think it's the Game 15 system. That's worth taking a look at if you're curious about those. Apart from their Game & Watch LCD handheld games, Nintendo hadn't really tried to break into the home market in a serious way. Then they had a massive arcade hit with Shigeru Miyamoto's Donkey Kong, and they decided they needed something to get into the home. They needed a home console that could play arcade-style games. So, in '83, they released the Nintendo Family Computer, later known as just the Famicom. That was launched in Japan, but straight after being released, they had to recall it. They had a fault in the connection between the chipset and the motherboard, and they were crashing. So Hiroshi Yamauchi decided it was better to pull them all back, fix them, and ship them back out again when they were right, than to have dodgy, unreliable systems in the marketplace, which would ruin Nintendo's reputation. So they were all withdrawn. They were re-released with a new chipset, and also the buttons on the controllers were different. The original controller buttons, and this is not the Famicom version, but these here were originally square, and they were prone to getting stuck. So while they were sorting out the chipset, they changed the buttons to circular. Sales of the Famicom were absolutely through the roof, but of course, when everyone's buying them, it reaches a point where everyone's bought them and sales topped out. So to continue expanding and basically stay in business, Nintendo had to start selling overseas, and that really meant the US market. That was not an easy thing for them to try and do, because at that time, you probably know about the video gaming crash, early 80s. Everyone had got their Ataris and whatever, and the market was saturated with really crap games like E.T. and Pac-Man. People had got totally sick of it. You know, they didn't know what was a good game and what was a bad game, and so often they bought a game thinking this might be good, and it was crap. I mean, really crap, and they were sick of it, so people just stopped buying games, which made the US market a really difficult place to try and sell a video games console. In 1984, Nintendo of America demonstrated, well, the Famicom, renamed as the Nintendo Advanced Video System, at the CES, and it was a disaster. Potential distributors, they either completely ignored it or outright laughed at it. You know, Nintendo of America were mocked, that they were a laughing stock for even thinking about trying to sell a games console. But Hiroshi Yamauchi, head of Nintendo, he thought, no, we can sell this over there. He was convinced there was a market for it, they just needed the right strategy. So he had the Famicom completely redesigned. So they redesigned it, gave us this wonderful, beautiful grey slab of dullness, really. Made it try to fit in with consumer electronics, like your video recorders. I mean, it's a cartridge games machine, so they're disguising that fact by, you know, flip up lid, stick the cartridge in the front, have it go down, so it's like a VHS video recorder. But then they added other peripherals like the zapper gun and that robot thing that was really quite pointless, which to me seems kind of odd, because it's like, is it consumer electronics? Is it a toy? It was ultimately marketed as a toy, but it worked. They trialled it in New York, basically said to potential retailers, look, take this, any you can't sell, we'll give you your money back, we'll take them back, no risk. And that was a big gamble for Nintendo, because if they produced loads of them and they didn't sell, they were out of pocket. But it meant that the retailers would risk stocking them, and it worked. They didn't sell in huge bucket loads, they sold about 50,000 of them, and that was enough to convince them, okay, maybe there is a gaming market to be had here. So by 1986 Nintendo went national, started selling it over the whole of the US. They had a very strict licensing policy. Developers were forced to sign this license whereby they were only allowed to sell 5 games a year. But the idea was the market wouldn't be saturated with rubbish games. Anything that was released would be top quality because the time and effort had been put in to make it good. But to enforce this policy, the NES had a lockout chip. Theoretically, this chip was to prevent piracy and to prevent grey importing. So you couldn't just import a game from another region and slap it in your NES. It had to be from your region. But also the lockout chip meant that anyone without a license couldn't put a game in the NES. It did work though. The quality of games released were very high. The market wasn't saturated, and those who were prepared to deal with Nintendo and abide by this licensing policy did extremely well. The Nintendo itself, they completely cornered the market in the US and indeed in Japan. Part of this licensing deal was that developers, when they released a game on the NES, were not allowed to release it on any other system for 5 years, which basically meant Sega. They were frozen out of the market because the NES having been there first, people released their games on that. Sega came along and no one could release anything on it. If you were going to make games in the US, it was on the NES, full stop. Nothing else got a look in. Hugely successful. Basically making games for the NES was a license to print money. Towards the end of '86, the NES began trickling into Europe, and by mid-'87 into the UK via Mattel. But really, '87, the Sega Master System already had a good footing in the UK, and gaming was also largely dominated by home computers. And at the low end, the Sinclair Spectrum was just... everyone had one. At the high end of the market, you had the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST. This made for a very difficult market for Nintendo to break into. They had been concentrating on the US and Japanese markets, and Mattel didn't do a great job of marketing the NES in the UK. So eventually Nintendo took over the sales and marketing in the UK and Europe, and it wasn't a complete disaster by any means. It was successful, it sold well, but unlike in the US and Japan, it wasn't able to completely dominate. Also, they didn't get things all their own way as far as the lockout chip was concerned. The UK developers and programmers were a lot more belligerent in terms of the Nintendo licensing policy. They didn't like it, so companies found ways around it, either with pass-through sockets on their cartridges, so you would plug someone else's cartridge, licensed cartridge, into your cartridge and get by it that way. Rare famously reverse engineered the 10 NES chip. Another company would basically stun the 10 NES chip. That they would put a charge through the system, a voltage spike or whatever, which stunned the 10 NES lockout chip, and their software would run, completely bypassing the lockout. Nintendo didn't get things all their own way in the UK, but the system was successful enough. It continued for years, without being top dog it was old technology, but continued to sell. You could get software and games in the bargain bins, lots of cheap software, quality software, a lot of it, dirt cheap. So it remained popular for quite a few years after you would have expected it to have passed its sell-by date. And indeed in Japan, even though they stopped selling or producing software by 1994, they continued to make the console itself until 2003. Though there wasn't a demand for new software, the retro scene, people reminiscing, nostalgia, all of that, they were still buying the consoles, which ultimately made it a very, very, very long-lived machine.